Bonjour.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being with us for this session where we're going to be talking about the future of agriculture. So we'll take a French and European look and talk about how to restore a future to French and European agricultural production. We will open up the floor to a debate at the end. My name is Isabelle Goudin-Levy. I work on LCI as a journalist. Now, this session will be introduced in just a while by Akiko Suwa-Eisenman, who is a research director at the INRIS, who's president of the expert group of the United Nations Commission on Food Security. She's a member of the Cercle des Économistes. We also have the pleasure of welcoming Thierry Blandinière, who is next to her. He is the general manager of In Vivo. Then we have Gabriel Alpern, who's a philosopher. You've just written this book that I have in my hands, so Creating Bridges Between the World, a philosophy from the field, so published by Fayard. You've also written so Philosophizing and Cooking with Philippe Gomez, and you were chosen to be the sponsor of the National Agriculture Days that happened last June. We also have the pleasure of welcoming Philippe Mauguin, who is the CEO of ENRE, and in the center we have Olivier Péqueux, president of the Groupama Asset Management Group and financial director of the group. And next to me, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Nadia Samout, who is a Michelin-starred chef at the Auberge La Fénière, which is in Bourg-Marin, in the Luberon. So you have 2 red stars and 1 green star for your cooking, which is gluten-free, plant-based, and local, and we'll talk about that. So we'll start straight away with the presentation of our theme, and that will be Akiko Suwa-Eisenman, who's going to talk to us about the challenge for agriculture today in a French context, which is quite complex with everything that's happening from a legislative point of view, with the famous law that's been examined by the Senate and will be examined by the National Assembly very shortly. Yes, thank you, everybody. So this plan law is being presented by its opponents as a step backwards. So with neonicotinoids authorized in Europe to 2033, forbidden in France since 2018, we're bringing up the thresholds above which large-size breeding farms are submitted to environmental recommends. And this law is a law about the food and agricultural sovereignty in March, and it is there to respond to the revolts of farmers in 2024. They want to have enough revenue and be able to pass down their agriculture to future generations. So the agro-food sector in France is a paradox. 5% only of the GDP, but it's so important for our everyday life, so that we are the 5th exporter in the world, but also 6th importer as well. Agriculture is also a social redundancy theme that we never hear about. 310,000 farms that have gone down by 40% in the past 20 years. So we've got only 1/3 have less than 25,000 euros a year. And that's why it's important to have political support to the common agricultural policy. So European agriculture is facing several challenges. There was a recent edition of Mermoz that you can find on the Cercle des Économistes site. Agriculture must mitigate the effects of climate change and face deterioration of soils and the harmful effects on the health and the environment of intensive agriculture, improve animal welfare, and facilitate access to all to healthy food at affordable prices. Now, the COVID pandemic and then the war in Ukraine have really brought back the question of food sovereignty and European food sovereignty, showing our dependence on a number of key inputs provided by a small number of countries. On top of that, France is facing the competition of other larger European producers. In a complex world, policies need to be based on science, and the United Nations experts group that I preside, the equivalent of the IPCC for agriculture is writing up reports on agriculture. So the challenges are multiple, and some of these challenges seem to be contradictory. How can we increase the European production capacity when we know that preserving the environment requires smaller yields? How can we be competitive when we want to increase the income of our farmers? On top of that, agriculture itself is highly diverse. Some might even say that it's very unequal between large farms focused on exports and focusing on competitive prices and small organic farms. The agricultural sector itself is in a vice between the market power in terms of inputs and purchasing procedures. So this concerns all of us. What future for French and European farmers? Are objectives irreconcilable? Anyway, we have a lovely panel to help us with that question. Thank you, Akiko. So perhaps we can go around the panel to see how you can react to what Akiko said. So there are contradictions with the wish to move towards agriculture and food that is healthier, sustainable, and then this context where perhaps we have the impression that we're going backwards when it comes to the environment. So Thierry Blondiniès, hello. Thank you, Akiko. It really is a perfect summary of the situation. Everything's been said, everything's been covered, so that's what we can say, that's the observation. But what about economic players? How can they seize this question and find solutions? We'll come back to that. But perhaps a few words about the Plan Law today, which is seen as a step backwards. We see it as a reprogramming, a reset for transitions. So it focuses on food sovereignty. So it's essential to have food sovereignty. We need to be able to demonstrate that we can produce more and sustainably. And we've got to think about French and European agriculture. So we've got to reprogram a transition trajectory that takes into account the failings of the first law that had a considerable impact. So we didn't measure the impact of the Green Deal on the drop in European and French production. Then we're importing more carbons, we're importing more products that are not in line with European standards. So that's why there are contradictory orders. So we've got to integrate the fact today that limiting our imports and producing more in Europe is important. Now, the fashion is focusing today on tariffs and taxes. So we've got to think about a tax for imported products that are in line with European standards. So it's not a considerable tax, but a small tax maybe is a few percent to send a message to the world, create a message, a strong message that would allow us to say that Europe is creating its own model and is protecting itself. So Philippe Mauguin, sorry. So do you agree with what Thierry Blondinière has just said? It's a kind of a reset that we need. How do we need to move forward in this apparently paradoxical context? Well, hello, everybody. What is complicated, and this is what we heard with Akiko, it's an economic sector, agriculture, which is vital for humanity. Food is not a product like any other. It's based on living organisms. It's produced by tens of thousands of farmers across the world in extremely diverse agroclimatic conditions. So we don't have time to go back over the history of what's happened in the WTO. So progressively, we've been opened up to exchanges with the idea of improving trade and competitiveness. We've got less protection today. So it's true that we're in a paradoxical situation where we're seeing a consensus from experts that we have to change the agricultural model. The model that we have in France, in Europe, in America, and in Asia, that model is not sustainable. And what we're hearing from the IPCC and the work that Akiko and her colleagues is doing show all of this. So we need to move. The systems that we have today are not sustainable, but we're seeing generalized competition. That's the environment. So all of the markets are all of the margins are very small. So there's, people don't want to move, don't want to change. So what's been happening in agricultural crises is showing the level of tension. European farmers are saying, why are we being asked to drop our use of plant-based products when our colleagues and competitors in Asia and elsewhere are using 1.5 times more? And it's true that INRAE has shown this. When you look at the cereals consumed by European citizens in 2024, the share of cereals imported from America or Asia has a content of pesticides that is more substantial, 1.5 times higher than the cereals produced in Europe. So there really is, on the one hand, and we've shown this with carbon, there's a carbon balance that is more substantial for agricultural products made in third countries. So it's not always the case, but between Europe and the rest of the world, there's a difference in terms of carbon. It's also true for plant-based products and their use. So in this context, European farmers for 2 years have said, we're fed up of this, the Green Deal is not realistic, we're being prevented from producing. So there's been a backward step, and with the Plan law, it's the same thing. French farmers are saying, yes, the neonicotinoids are banned in Europe. There's only one that's authorized, but it's not authorized in France. And in terms of access to water, for breeding, there are standards that are difficult. So they all want to be treated in the same way, and I understand this. I understand what their claims are. It's not all farmers who are asking for this, but we can understand why they are asking for this, given the high level of tension and given the movement. Now, these solutions, are they sustainable? Will they make it possible to prepare French agriculture for the next 20 years? The answer is no. So that means that perhaps we have to move down this road in order to establish competitive conditions that are more or less degraded, but that's not going to solve the problem. We need to change the production system. The market needs to get moving as well. And there are some positive examples that can help. We have research resources that will allow us to move forward. We'll talk about the solutions. Let's continue with our panel with Olivier Pequeux at Groupama, the first insurance company in France. You're saying that above all, it's important to contribute to confirming our food sovereignty in France and Europe. What do you mean by that? This word sovereignty, we're hearing it a lot. Well, sovereignty will allow us to guarantee 3 meals a day. We need to eat 3 times a day. Sometimes we forget about this. And sovereignty, it's about, and I agree with what Mr. Blondinier and Mr. Mauguin said, it means being competitive in our agricultural sector. You can't be sovereign in terms of food without being competitive. So it's the consumer who decides at the end of the day, and often the consumer decides based on the price of the product. So we have a certain number of debates that should be technical, but they become very political, if not controversial, when it comes to the ability of caring for plants and managing the essential resource that is water in a balanced way, and the taking into account of the European aspect with respect to these challenges. So Groupama is a professional agricultural association. We have 30,000 elected officials out there in France, and so that's quite a high number compared with the number of farmers. And according to crops, we've got cereal producers, we've got tree growers, we've got wine growers. They have different perceptions, and there are contradictions. So we have to find a means of having peaceful discussions about this subject. And as Philippe said, we need to take into account scientific considerations. And this is what was said yesterday in the forum. We need to go back to that notion of truth rather than being overly controversial. And there are a number of principles. and this echoes what you were saying, that are essential. First of all, we've got to guarantee the principle of food sovereignty in Europe, and that's just based on common sense. We only accept imports that respect our standards. So we've got to be more demanding with our farmers. So these are the challenges of different laws, and we've got to make sure that we are looking into competitive ideas and prices. So we've got questions with respect to economic organization that we need to answer, but also when it comes to rules of the game, things need to be played out on a balanced playing ground. So, Gabrielle Halpern, let's have your opinion as a philosopher with respect to this current paradox. Is that not just the reflection of our society as a whole? Yes, hello. Yes, yes, it is a reflection of the paradoxes in our society and of humanity generally speaking. And this is where I would like to draw a link between agriculture and the theme chosen for the rencontre. You know, facing the shock of realities. So you've got the reality of agriculture, and then you've got reality generally speaking. I'm going to take a phrase from Arends in a book saying that agriculture is not the oldest job in the world, it's the most sacred. And it's interesting to use that term sacred. Why does she say this? Well, she says this because human beings are perhaps slightly different from other animals. Animals have a very natural role in the world. You know, they move around naturally, but for human beings, everything's a bit artificial. It's a little bit like we're a strange animal that catapulted into the world. And agriculture attaches us to reality, to earth, to the environment, and we can be attached to reality thanks to this. It's a bit like agriculture has become a form of blind spot, a kind of a spot on our consciousness, or as if we're connected to everything that's virtual and nothing that's real. And when we talk about reality, we don't have many, we've got lots of adjectives: augmented reality, virtual reality, as if reality was no longer enough and we needed to talk about many other things. And that's where agriculture can teach us something. And this brings us back to the question of the paradox. Now, if our rationality were really useful to be able to build science and understand the world around us, natural phenomena, then at the same time, our reality has become rigid. It's transformed our brain as a massive production of gas, and we realize that we're doing this all day. We're putting people in boxes. There are start-uppers, there are farmers, there are young people, there are seniors. We spend our time putting people in boxes, in drawers. And so we're creating absurd and artificial frontiers between jobs, sectors, generations. And not only these absurd and artificial frontiers are reinforcing divides in society, they are leading to, the creation of these contradictory orders. You've got ecology, you've got productivity, you've got the economy, you've got sovereignty. We're spending our time producing boxes. And of course, they contradict the other boxes because we're so much focused on categorizing things. And so that's why we've got these paradoxes in relation to agriculture. And that's why we have these contradictory impositions. So how can we reconcile with reality? Well, coming back to agriculture, it's an example, an illustration of how we might be able to think differently. Because we're thinking ecology on one side, agriculture on the other, productivity, etc. We've got to learn to reconcile all of these different worlds. Yes, well done. We can applaud Gabrielle. Nadia Samut, you're saying that it's important to look to 2040, and we've got to feed the soil and the soul. We've got to reconcile both. Well, thank you for this invitation. Yes, I am a chef, so we've got to disconnect our brain from our wishes. We're talking about feeding, we're talking about farmers, but then there's the earth, the natural environment. That's what we have to reconnect to. We're talking about competitiveness, but what can it give us? And I work on the desirable future, what is virtuously delicious. You know, we are all feeders, and so I work in the agricultural high school on the understanding of what it means to be a feeder, nurturer. When I arrived in the agricultural school, I was told, are you sure that you're going to be teaching them things in that way? In fact, if we want to talk about sovereignty today, we need to learn to eat food from our local area. We need to be proud of what people do in our local area. I started with the chickpea from the Mediterranean. We've known it since the Soca in Nice, the Cada in Toulon, and we've got Farinata in Genoa. You understand what I mean? We are creating imaginary food scenarios, and we need to work with farmers for this. I work with farmers in the south, in Avignon, and the pupils wanted to plant, to sow and to plant, and so we went back down the path of gastronomical history. We're planting in 2025, and we will be able to harvest the benefits in the future. So it's important to look at all of the nurturing branches. We need to have conversion workshops, otherwise the products are going to be going elsewhere. We need to have a shared discussion as feeders, as nurturers. Thank you very much. So that's one solution. So we knew what the situation was like. For you, Philippe Mauguin, there are other solutions for being less dependent, for having fewer greenhouse gases with this diversification for pulses. This is an idea that has to be explored, perhaps with more plants, less meat. What is the solution that you're suggesting, or the solutions in the plural? Yes, let me just come back to what Nadia was saying with the example of the chickpea. It's true that we have resources. We have resources that are can offer advantages in terms of food, very tasty as well, because food is about pleasure as well, and that are good for the environment, good for the earth, good for the soil. So the pulses are interesting, and the chickpea is a pulse. So these are plants that contribute to fixing part of the nitrogen from the air. They fix it in the earth, and that produces nitrogen-based fertilizer for plant growth. And it's not something from chemistry. It doesn't come from Russia or Belarus with a high content of carbon, and that is costly for farmers. And I agree with what Gabriel was saying just beforehand. There's no point opposing ecology and economy. When we take the example of inputs and fertilizers and plant-based products, these are products that are expensive. They can be very expensive. The energy crisis saw huge inflation, creating a very difficult situation for farmers. And they have a carbon content that's negative. They're costly, they're imported, and so that raises the question of sovereignty, because we're dependent on phosphates from North Africa. So we have good relations today, but will that last? In terms of nitrogen-based products, that's Russia and Russia. So we've got to find alternatives. The example of pulses shows that we can have an agroecological approach by diversifying pulses. That's good. They're good for the soil. We can introduce them into rotation farming, and that helps with food. Now, the second question, well, everything's linked, obviously. What about the medium-term solutions when it comes to feeding the planet? When there are 10 billion people on the planet in the future, we will need 30% more food. And this has to be provided by farmers across the world because of climate change, because it will speed up. It will be even more complicated in the future. It's complicated today enough. So hopefully we will be able to resist deforestation. It's a big challenge. So for this, we're going to need progress from research, and there is progress in terms of agroecology, but we'll probably have to change our diets as well. I'm saying that we need breeding, we need animal breeding. Organic farming is a good example. Organic farming uses organic additions. However, we need to consume less animal-based products and more plant-based products. We need to balance things out. If we listen to nutritionists, on average, the recommendation is to have 50% animal proteins and 50% plant proteins in our diet for somebody of an average age. We're at 65% animal proteins in Europe and in North America. Now, if the entire world, the 10 billion inhabitants, eat as much meat as the Americans and the North Americans in the future, we won't be able to fulfill the equation. So we've got to help our breeders in France and Europe. We've got to assume the idea that we need to diversify, that we need to rebalance our diets. So plant-based protein is good. It's good for health, good for farmers, good for the soil. So with chickpeas, we can have an interesting base for different culinary preparations. Yes, the chickpea is a great base. It's the gold in my kitchen. In fact, we've got to be proud of our food model. We've got to retrain people. We've got to create desire. We've got chickpeas in falafel, in different mousse, but I use it for making ice creams and all kinds of different things. And that's what's fundamental. You know, it's raising awareness, but also making people want to try new things. And we are in a country where gastronomy is very important. It's known across the world. So if we make this country a nurturing country, we will have a transmission mode considering food from the earth and food for the body. So it's also about getting farmers on board and changes to soils. This is the solution also that you're working on. Yes, the challenge is to reconnect farmers with citizens. So we have a role to play that's important, where we are economic players. We have to pass on messages. So we need to have competitive, sustainable farming. How can we get that message across? So concretely, this means that we have to move forward with solutions that make it possible to find a new form of agriculture that ticks all of the boxes. So that's the real challenge. But we do have solutions. For example, let's take large field crops. We've got regenerative agriculture that takes into account the quality of soil. That means, crop rotation with wheat, pulses, etc. So how do we get all farmers on board with this transformation? First of all, we've got to guarantee that their production will be sold at the right price. That's our role. We've got to set up contracts in the long term to finance the transition. And it's the economic player that has to be committed to that. It's agro-food companies that have to be involved. The second point is that public policies need to change to help us to secure income for farmers that are happy to make the transition, because that involves risk. Over the 5-year period, we know that a farmer who changes his model, he takes a risk, and the risk is less income over that 5-year period. So a drop in 150 euros. So we need an insurance system, perhaps, that can cover the risk. So we have solutions. We're going to work with lots of farmers, cereal farmers. So we've got lots of pilot farms already that exist. So now we've got to get all cereal farmers on board with this transformation. So Olivier Péqueux, you've set up solutions for reforming harvest insurance, and it's important to provide support to these farmers. As Thierry Blandinier was saying, there's this wish to make the change, but they need to be supported. Yes, it's not just about supporting them through change, that's obvious, but the job of being a farmer, it's very much subject to climate hazards, increasingly so, yes. You know, so it's different in the world where you are an employee. So it's important to have insurance, and to accompany transitions, there are certain practices that reduce risks that are perhaps going to be reducing. So new solutions need to be found. I spent 7 years in China developing agriculture insurance systems, and there was a focus on sovereignty. The Chinese government understood that agriculture insurance is very important for food sovereignty. Today, we're talking about $20 billion in terms of insurance in China. This is much higher than what we have in France, so we were behind. So a very ambitious reform has been carried out, exemplary in terms of public-private partnerships over the past few years, with the involvement of insurance companies, farmers, and the state. We're setting up a pool in order to better pool the risks to which all of these stakeholders are exposed. 600 million euros in insurance premium in 2020, 900 million last year. So you can see that we're moving towards what they have in China and North America. So we're in a world that has now become aware of the need to support the income of farmers through different cycles and to accompany these transitions. And we're there to provide solutions, of course. And I think that's good news. We're not talking much about this, but there are solutions being implemented.
Gabrielle Halpern, there's another issue at stake here as well, the question of innovation. We need to think about our models in the longer term in order to bring the whole sector along with us in this change, as we say, from farm to fork. We need to get all of the stakeholders in the field involved. We talk a lot about farmers who struggle perhaps more than some of the other partners in this whole value chain. We need all of the manufacturers, the processors, change their perspective on farming and agriculture. Yes, indeed, and change their perspective on food as well. It's all connected, and that's what's really important. Farming is not just a sector, it's like a mirror held up to our society, and this issue of food is a question of civil society. The German philosopher Nietzsche said all prejudices are linked to fate, and farming can bring about prejudices or be the fruit of prejudices. I was shocked when I heard last year, I heard tell of a study that was carried out, a survey that was carried out with young French people, and most French people didn't know the difference between cucumbers and courgettes. And I said, what's happened for us to get there? The former chef at the Élysée president, Guillaume Courbet, said, how can we understand the meaning of our life without taking care of our food? So if we can't tell the difference between cucumbers and courgettes, it's difficult. We talk about reality. That's reality. Cucumbers and courgettes. So to answer your question, we're going to need to create new connections, new relationships between all of the different stakeholders. We might need a bit of a different approach to innovation. The Greek philosopher Anaxagoras said, in nature, nothing perishes, but existing things combine and recombine. This is an interesting definition of innovation. There's no pure creation or destruction. It's always existing things that combine and recombine. Let me give you a very concrete example of this. It's one of the things I've been working on for several years. The issue of food in care homes. When you're an older person, one of the last remaining pleasures is the food and the meals, and it's been really tricky to develop a business model in order to make sure there is a good connection between care homes and the local farmers who are working and growing food close to those care homes in order to create good meals for the residents. When the will is there, when there's a will, there's a way. And I've got some examples of care homes which have worked very closely with local farmers in order to sign contracts and agreements for short-circuit value chains in order to offer local raw products which are then cooked in the care home. And when the manager said, oh, that's going to be too tricky, it's too expensive. The managers of the care homes who've done it were able to create a restaurant that is open to anyone who wants to come in, and that generated enough income to help the farmers make a decent living. And one of the key questions here is the question of price and value. Over the last few years, I think there's been a bit of political marketing around the idea of purchasing power, where we needed to buy things, make things cheaper, when food actually, we think that there are some products we pay more money for. But when I spoke to these care home managers who were a bit braver than others and who put in place this healthier approach to food, they said, in the end, it's actually cheaper for us. The food is very good. Half of the food in care homes is wasted, but not in our case, because the older people in our homes, older residents, are enjoying their meals and not wasting so much. So you need to rethink the relationships between the different stakeholders in this value chain in order to make things healthier and sustainable from a health and social and territorial point of view. Philippe Morgan. We're at the Rencontre Économique in Aix. In 1960, food and drink represented about 40% of household spending, but now it's 15.5%. In some ways, that's a good thing. We're spending more on health and on leisure time, on housing, because that's obviously a key concern for households today, but the proportion of spending on food and beverages has significantly reduced. In the COVID times, there was a significant growth. It rose up to 18%, rose a percentage point and a half during the COVID time, but then it dropped back down to 16. And despite inflation, despite the war in Ukraine, the spending on food and drink is really low. All the stakeholders that we're talking about, whether we're talking about farmers selling to cooperatives or selling to food manufacturers, the products that are going to end up in our supermarkets, they're all fighting to provide cheap food to households who are struggling in terms of their impact. There's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of stress in the market. So when we talk about agroecology, people say it costs 5% or more. The farmers will say, no, we can't do that. Thierry Blantière. Let me talk about the economic aspect. I want to talk about the price of a baguette in France, very important thing in France. There are some supermarkets that are selling a baguette at 29 cents. 1 cent more would be 50 euros more per ton for the production. So Michel-Edouard Leclerc, the head of Leclerc supermarkets, needs to change his policy. He needs to stop saying that he is defending consumers' purchasing power against the food producers. He needs to change his approach. There's an issue around public policy and lobbying, which means that a baguette needs to always get cheaper and cheaper, so you can demonstrate that because the baguette costs less, everything is cheaper. We need to change the approach. So we need to discuss things with supermarkets. It's a philosophical debate. How are you going to support us in the transition? How are you going to change your price markers? Let's continue talking about solutions. Olivier Becqueux, you've put in place solutions to help farmers diversify their revenue streams with methanization, solar power, wind power, and you've also started a private debt-funded fund for farmers to help them diversify their income, and it's a form of hybridization, which is a theme that is close to Gabrielle Halpern's heart. Support to the farming sector has a lot of different faces. We play a role in risk management, energy production, energy generation is a solution which has three benefits. It provides additional income, it helps agriculture get greener. It's responsible for about 20% of CO2 emissions, and One of the key messages is that we need to add things up rather than oppose them. So using methanization means recycling waste. There are piles of bread by methanization plants, which unfortunately are going to waste, but they can be used to generate energy. Methanization units can represent an investment of 5, 6, 8 million euros. A number of farms could get together to fund it. You will need public-private partnerships to ensure a stable income, but there are some very technical issues that are required to get it started. But we've got a range of very appropriate solutions: methanization, solar power. All of these are going to be important for the future of farming. Another point, we were talking about innovation. The future of farming requires innovation, and that's going to require investment. That's why Groupama has created a private equity fund for agriculture, for the whole agricultural sector, farming and agricultural production, seeds, phytosanitary testing. All of this innovation is really important to foster innovation. We need to invest in the industry, in equipment and hardware, in the distribution chain, whether local or more global. We need to invest in logistics. All of these investments are very much needed in order to provide funding for the future of agriculture. Thierry Blondière, I think you enjoy rugby. Is that right? A lover of rugby. I think one of the strengths of French farming is that we've got some front row structures. We've got other actors in the second row and the third row, like Groupama, and I think that can be very good for French and European farming. Thierry Blondière, I don't know if you want to talk about rugby, but in terms of the solutions that you're working on, I think there could be a number of things you talk about, having a green fertilizer listed on the Euronext stock exchange. I think there's a lot of things that you're working on. There's a lot of solutions that could be put in place. I think we need to work against the price-based model. I was talking about the price of a baguette earlier. We need to understand that when our food is produced in an environmentally friendly model, it's a bit more expensive. We used the Planet Score logo on some products. It's a bit like the food quality score, but a Planet Score, and you get a red, green, or a different colour to show whether the product is good for the planet, good for the environment. We're struggling to communicate with consumers about the transitions that farmers are going through. Planet Score would be an approach to do that, to help consumers understand the difference in price between different products. It's not about organic products which are 50% more expensive, and what I'm talking about is 5 to 10% more expensive. We're talking about going from 29 to 34 cents. It's just a few cents for consumers, and I think that our supermarkets and retailers need to get hold of this issue and explain that 34-cent baguettes are carbon-free. Let's stop selling a baguette at 29 cents. So when we talk about commodities, we need to work on a large scale, big quantities of cereals, which could have a green label. We would then get them listed on the Euronext stock exchange, 30 or 40 euros per ton. We have listed commodities in the markets. We could say we've got green commodities on the market with a Planet Score and the everyday normal commodities, and that might lead to quite rapid change. So I think that France and Europe needs to work on this, work with the Euronext exchange to ensure that we can list green wheat on the market. You only need to have about 4,000 or 5,000 tons, and we would need to work with farmers to do that. And we're doing so in the north of France. Nadia Samut, how do you see this cooperation between different stakeholders in the value chain from farm to fork, as we say? Over the last 10 years, I've been trying to create this nurturing model with starting with agriculture schools, working on chickpeas. I had to get committed. It was a bit of a utopic idea at the time. It was a time of transition that we focused on, and then you need to go further and converting things, working with local producers and growers, and then there's the issues around logistics, transport and distribution. You have to focus on this. There's a lot of issues when you have small-scale producers in a local area. So I have managed to work with a distributor called Transgourmet that I played a role in supporting, in training their staff in how to play this nurturing role, because salespeople are selling food products every day, and so I needed to train them and help them to understand what we were trying to do. Help them to understand who is buying the products. Hospitals, care homes, these things I really care about. As a chef, I sometimes maybe only serve 35 people per day, but I'm interested. I care about what citizens eat every day. So when I worked with the Transgourmet company, there's also the co-work company who wanted to get involved in the transition. Not just in words, but really in action, in a thoroughgoing manner. And I've been providing support for them for the last 4 years. And what I've decided to do is to go and work with the Accor hotel group to help them to help train their nurturers, the people who are cooking and serving food every day. And that opens up a market to a much wider range of small producers, small growers to sell their products into the whole sector. So there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of transformation. When I started to talk about chickpeas in the agriculture schools, it wasn't something that was talked about very in a widespread way. We had to adapt things, so we had to find the right seeds, and it was tricky. We've got a chickpea that's grown around here in Aix, which is great. Then there's another issue around food wastage. We need to make a change in our society. We need to change our view of food and waste nothing. There's nothing in our food products that is not usable, not noble, and that's something that I talk about a lot when I talk to the agriculture school. When we use pulses, we can use every ingredient that comes out of the mill. Thank you very much. We can give Nadia a round of applause. So we're going to take some questions from the floor in a few minutes, so get ready. But I just wanted to hand the floor back to Philippe Mauguin. Yes, just to add to what's been said, we started by talking about a situation that seems rather stuck, but it's interesting to listen to different members of the panel to talking about how things are moving forward. Not everything is stuck or blocked in France and Europe in terms of the transition towards agroecology. There is some tension, but now is the time when we need to show what is happening in the field, on the ground. Your experience is very interesting, very local. We're partners. And we work with agricultural cooperatives in various local areas. The Dijon Metropolitan Council has committed to ensuring local agriculture is going into all of the pulses are going into all the diets in all of their collective food outlets in care homes and schools and so on. So we need to work with all of the stakeholders, growers, farmers, cooperatives, food manufacturers. Some of the answers are going to be found in local areas. That's how we're going to move things. Before we take questions from the floor, let's hand the floor back to Gabrielle. Do we need a hybrid approach, a hybrid business model? I'm sure that's what your last book is saying. There'll be a signing session at the next door stand, the FNAC stand. This hybrid model is very important. Yes, when I use the term hybridization, what I'm talking about is creating bridges between different worlds, recreate bridges between worlds, and it's very urgent because different worlds don't really know what's going on. There's a Japanese philosopher who says, the book is called And you, how do you live? It's a book that was from 1937, and it says these people that make the clothes that you wear and grow the food that you eat are unknown to you. This sentence from 1937 shows us that things haven't really moved on very much. All of these people that make these essential things for life are still strangers to us. And this lack of knowledge, lack of awareness of other people gives rise to prejudice and sometimes even disdain. And the issue is how we can build bridges between different stakeholders, producers and consumers. There's an issue of education, but the work experience that people have to do when they're age 14 or 15 could perhaps be a mandatory work experience in a farm or a food production thing. We need to think about business models, organizational models. We hear about co-farming and hybrid models. So with the newer farmers who are bringing in new skills and new talents in order to renew some of the models that are used. As Philippe Morgan said, there's a lot going on, and I think we need to invest in farmers. They enjoy experimenting. They're used to dealing with the unpredictability of the world. I want to wrap up with a phrase from Albert Camus, who said something I really like. He said, oh dear, I've just forgotten what I was going to say. He says, there are lots of people who are despairing around us. He says, those who despair are bastards. And we need to, rather than focusing on things that aren't working and despairing, there are a lot of really beneficial things, lots of great things. Let's look at what's working. Let's make sure that develops further. Thank you very much, Gabrielle. There's not a lot of time for questions, I'm afraid, but we might be able to take just a small handful. So if you could ask very brief questions and introduce yourselves. Good morning. I'm one of the youth members of the panel here. Thank you very much for everything that's been said this morning. I'd like to go back to the title of the session, Restoring a Future to Agricultural Production. Future requires looking ahead, but it also requires us to take care of the environment, also taking care of the men and women who work in agriculture, who find the work hard physically. Agriculture is a profession where there's a lot of suicide, there's a lot of disease linked to pesticides and physical issues related to the hard work. How can we provide support to these men and women in order to take care of their physical and mental health? One thing I'd like to say, I hear very much what you're saying, but on a political level, we need to make sure that we buy into this idea of transforming French farming. We need to understand that change is necessary. We need to support social changes in terms of the size of farms. We need to stop dreaming about these family businesses that are not profitable. We need to say to ourselves, this model is no longer viable. It's going to be too difficult for you. We'll provide support to you as you change. It's a kind of redundancy plan in a way in terms of farming in Europe, but we need to provide the support for the people. We don't want people to be poor. I very much understand what we're talking about, but we need to be very clear in how we talk about it. This profession used to exist, but it might not exist in the same way tomorrow. Let's do things a bit differently. One point. There are other people who say, no, that's not true. There are some small farms that are getting by. It's not just big farms that are going to have a future. Look at the reality of the market. There are some small farms that are doing well, and there's some big ones that will require support as well. There's not a lot of time. Could we ask another question? Introduce yourself if you could. I'm an auditor, financial auditor. I've got a question about the Egalim law, which says that there's a minimum margin of 10%. Has this law had the expected effect for farmers? And there are some retailers that don't seem to be following through with this. There are some statements that are made by that to say here's a message, but in terms of small farms, yes, some are working, but let's think about the reality of the business model. The question is what business models do we have? What's the market? If we talk about this law that you referred to, it's quite simple. The dairy sector has done quite well. I think everything has been respected. The income has stabilized for dairy producers. It's worked well in this area. In other sectors of agriculture, it's been a lot more difficult because often it's not a product that's sold as is. It's processed and manufactured. So the EGalim it doesn't help cereal producers. For the dairy sector, it has worked. Akiko, I think we're going to hand the floor to you to wrap up. I'm just going to say two things. The first magic word is a rugby pack. We need to work as a pack, like in rugby, in a scrum. And the second thing is that we need to diversify. We need big and small farmers. We haven't talked about the Mercosur deal. In Brazil, there are big farmers and small farmers, and the small farmers are very mistrustful as well of the EU Mercosur deal. So we need to help the small producers diversify. We need to diversify our own behavior as well. Eat more fruit and vegetables. Eat chickpeas. Drink chickpea milk, which I never heard of. Just to finish off on rugby, I'm the chair of Brive Rugby Club, and we're playing in Aix soon, so do come and watch us play at the stadium in Aix.
Bonjour à
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here in spite of the heat that we're having for the rencontre in Aix. Please take a seat. Thank you for those following us online. Today we're going to be talking about a subject that is preoccupying for France and its social model. It's the idea of building a full employment society. We've got some speakers with us today who are prestigious. Now, Stefano Scarpetta was unable to come, unfortunately, this year. So anyway, we're going to ask the question, is full employment a mirage? And what can we say about this subject, given our unemployment rate between 7 to 10%? With us, I have lots of great people. I've got Stéphane Carcio, who is a member of the Cercle. He's a director of the employment and income at the OECD. Then we have François Omery, who is a union representative, so for managers, but not just for managers. Alongside him, we have Christelle Morancé, who is president of the Regional Council for the Pays de la Loire region. We also have Benoît Derigny, who is the CEO of Manpower Group. Of course, we all know who Manpower is. And then just next to me, there is Arnaud Gangloff. You head KEA. KEA is the first consultancy for general managers in terms of strategy and consumption. So perhaps we can start by looking at the situation. It's always good to see what we have. And so I'm going to hand over to Stéphane for this. Thank you, Fanny. Yes. There are lots of questions with respect to this debate. I'll start by trying to define what full employment is, this holy grail that we're striving towards. Now, there's no set definition or specific definition. We often think that it's an employment rate that's close to 5%, but in OECD countries, we don't really have that much unemployment. We've got some countries that are above 5%, and that includes France, but most of them are below at 3.5%. So the labor market is really quite in tension. So that gives us an idea. The second definition of full employment is the employment rate, the percentage of people who could be working, who do work. Now, from that point of view, France has made a lot of progress, but we're close to 69% full employment. That's the biggest rate measured by INSEE, but it's 10 points below Germany. And if we want to reach Germany's rate, we'd have to create between 3 and 4 million jobs. So if you define full employment as an indicator that based on employment rate, well, that's quite a considerable indicator. The second question that I'd like to ask is, why is it important to have full employment? You know, is it really a priority? Well, it's important from different points of view. It's important for social cohesiveness. For example, full employment defines what people do in their life. It structures them. It makes it possible to include a lot of people in society. So employment is really very important for social cohesion. It's also very important for collective wealth. The GDP per head depends a lot on the number of people who are employed. And finally, it's also important for public finances. If we had Germany's employment rate, we'd have over 100 billion extra income in the coffers of the state. So that's important as well. It's also important from a social and economic point of view to have full employment, and from a financial point of view. So I'm now going to ask a number of questions. So France has introduced different structural reforms, and that's why we've had an increase in the employment rate recently. We've introduced reforms onto the labor costs. We've carried out reforms for inciting people to go back to work. We created France Travail to get rid of any obstacles around employment. We focused on apprenticeships, so we've created individual training accounts, we've put back money into the education system. So we have the impression that we've done an awful lot of reforms for employment. But so why are we not yet in full employment with all of these reforms that have been introduced over the past 15 years? What should the strategy be? What more should be done? What should be the strategy for the next 10 years? What must we focus on? Now, to dig deep into this question, should we be removing obstacles at corporate level in order to create jobs? What are those obstacles? Should we be removing obstacles when it comes to employees and workers? And what are those obstacles? They're not just financial. They might be non-monetary obstacles as well. So these are some of the questions that we're going to try and answer today. So perhaps, Stéphane, we can just talk about why France, you mentioned it, but why France is so different from other countries in terms of rates. You were saying that in other countries they were at full employment. Is it a French exception? No, it's not a French exception. But there are some countries, and notably in the Mediterranean basin, that have full employment and that are seeing the same thing as in France. There are two subjects for France. France is quite good when it comes to including people between the ages of 25 and 50 years in the labour market. So there the full employment is comparable to that of Denmark. So there we're doing really well. So France is good when it comes to gender equality, not necessarily income, but on sharing the labour market. When we look at the difference between France and other countries, notably with Germany, we're in a much better position. So the problem is at the two ends of active life among young people and senior members of the society. For young people, we've got a difference of 20 points with respect to Germany. So for 15 to 25, we're at 55% in Germany. For senior members over 60s, the employment rate has gone up an awful lot. Following the pension reforms, we've gone up to 40% in Germany, where it's 60% for those over 60s. So these are the groups where we're seeing the biggest deficit. The last groups are, they're the groups of unqualified people who are fairly excluded from the labour market. And then there are people on long-term unemployment, and things haven't improved there. And then there are people who are not very well qualified. We often hear that in France that people don't want to work. François Omeret, you represent employees. In France, is there an exception? Do people have a different relationship with work? Does it take them longer to go back to work because they're not really looking to go back to work? Well, hello. Well, all of this, it's part of our imagination. So there's a positive change in employment in France. And it's based on the economic climate. Other countries in Europe and in the OECD have seen this similar improvements. And all of the reforms done, labor laws, etc., things that have contributed to make people's life more difficult in terms of employment, organizing economic competition against social competition, that's not had more impact here than in other countries. So let me talk about the difference with Germany. So the reforms were introduced in Germany 15 years ago, developing low-value jobs, and that also has an effect on the difference. And I won't talk about vocational training, which costs an awful lot of money for a very mediocre economic value. Now, I want to really dismantle something that everybody thinks, left-wing and right-wing. They all think that because we have an unemployment scheme, that people are not motivated to go back to work. That is just a lie, the biggest lie that we've had for 15 years. And we're hearing it all the time. It's a lie that is scientifically has scientifically been contradicted. Now, there are two things behind this. Today, between 5 and 6 million people are job seekers, and 2 million only are receiving unemployment. So this has nothing to do with the wish to go back to work. Now, there are studies that exist. Bruno Coquet, he's a researcher at the UFCE. He's one of the experts in this area. And he has figures to show that there is this, there's the value of the number of people who don't want to go back to work because they have money from the state. It's less than 10%. So the unemployment system is very different compared with other systems in Europe. It's financed based on the social cost paid by employees. It's not an obstacle to going back to work. It's been proven. There are obstacles, different obstacles. So social mobility, geographic mobility. And I think it's important at the beginning of this debate to remember all of that. So geographic mobility, it is difficult in France to organize it. This is one of the obstacles. Now, Christelle Morancet, you are the only elected official on this panel. So you head a very big region. How can we get people to come and work? What are your keys? How do you work on your catchment area to bring down the unemployment rate? Hello, everybody. So at the head of the most beautiful region of France. So let me just make an introductory speech before I answer and come back to what you've said. There's a major stake in France, major challenge, and that is to put the value of work back into the heart of our debate. This is essential. It needs to be underlined. Today, working for employees, the cost of, you need to earn more going out to work than staying at home. And I think that social benefits shouldn't be higher than that. So this is a radical thing to say, but it's important to underline it. But it's the debate about the cost of labor. And that's what we're hearing about a lot. And then there's another challenge. There's the challenge of, unemployment rates. Today, the unemployment rate in France, well, unemployment covers too long a period. There should be different periods. Longer periods where you receive unemployment, when you're on a difficult labor market, it needs to be reduced. So there are taboos about this question. So the COVID period, let's take the COVID period. It didn't help us. Think about caterers today. It's very difficult for them to take people on. People don't want to work at the weekends anymore. You also have the 35-hour week in France, where the country where we work the least. Now, we must remember that before distributing wealth, we need to try and produce it. And this means work. Our social model is based on work. In my region, I turned the tables 3 years ago. So we organized training for job seekers, qualifying training leading to employment. And the return to employment was 60%. So we had the best rate at national level. I had a region where the unemployment rate is the smallest in France. There isn't one day when business heads don't call me and tell me about how difficult it is to recruit people. When you have so much tension, it was important to act. So we set up a new model for training, because training organizations have a lot of money. Well, there's a lot of money that is invested in them by the state or others, but that has to be useful for the job market. So we need to start with the needs of companies and then train according to those needs, not just send people to training organizations. So their clients today are no longer the region, even if we're financing. Their clients are business heads. So it's important to point that out. And then there's another driver that's very important, and you mentioned that with the unemployment rate of young people. It's initial training. A reform was introduced, and that was the reform of professional high schools, vocational high schools. You haven't got the academic world and the economic world on the other. We have to have more links between the two. It's important to set up training that is in line with the needs of companies. Let's stop training young people for no reason. We've got to focus on the value of jobs. So we've got to drop or revise the cost of labor and speed things up when it comes to vocational training or other training. What do employers think about this? You are the link between employers and employees. What are you seeing? Tell me about the value of work. Has it disappeared? Do people no longer want to work at the weekend or have abnormal working hours? Or are the heads of business outfaced by the expectations of employees? What are you seeing? Thank you. Hello, everybody. So what we're seeing are three things. There's a conviction, and there are two questions relating to our activities. The first observation is that, and we're seeing it this year, when you have a GDP that is frozen, I think it's 1.5 for 2025. We're used to seeing an unemployment rate that goes up, and has not been the case. It's at 7.5, but it'll be at 7.7 by the end of the year. So that tells us about the structural modifications of the labor market. The second observation is that when you look at demographics, we look at the medium term, and we're looking at a shortage of talent for the future. In 2023, 6 million people over 65 years of age. In 2050, that we'll be looking at 12 million. So that really does tell us about the structural nature of the market. And the third observation that I'd like to share with you is that full employment is something that we already know to a certain extent. And because we know it geographically in a certain number of areas, if you take different counties, in the first half of the year, 27 have an unemployment rate below 26%. Others have over 10%, and there are 10 of these. So there are areas in France, and you mentioned this, where in reality, full employment, well, we're seeing it already. And there are situations that are close to full employment for certain jobs or sectors. You mentioned catering, the hotel sector. So there is the care industry as well, and industrial qualified jobs, welders, boiler makers, etc. But things are not going to improve. It's the same thing for the construction sector. Qualified jobs in construction, in building, these are jobs where, in reality, we're already familiar with full employment. So our conviction is that we're moving towards a full employment society. Now, the real question is, at what speed? And that's something that we can act on. The subject of geographic mobility, you mentioned this as well. I'd just like to take two examples. If you take the unemployment rate for Brittany, it's 7.3 for Carré. Vitry, it's 4. Between the two cities, I checked it this morning on the Via Michelin, it's 2 hours, 2.5 hours by car. So the next question is the cost of housing. In Carré, it's 1,300 euros per square meter. In Vitry, it's 2,500 euros per square meter if you want to buy. So you can live in one place and work in the other, possibly. The second determining factor is the attractiveness of certain jobs. Now, that's where we need to focus on training. We don't have enough applicants or candidates. So we're moving towards a full employment society. We need to prepare for that. That's telling us things about the future. But at what speed are we going to head towards that future? So tell us if you're seeing the same thing. You're focusing on a certain, even if it's for a certain type of job. Do you have full employment? Yes, we're seeing full employment. We're also seeing it among a certain number of our clients. There are concerns when it comes to senior members of society. 30% of over 55s in 5 years' time is what we're seeing. So there are needs of companies, but there are also the needs of the population. It's important to converge the needs of the population who are a bit fed up of certain jobs, and then there's the absence of back office jobs, where we need to shine a light on that. So there are subjects that were not very present that are coming back on the table. And the talent and skills of senior members of society have become a hot topic. Now, the organization where I work looks at an elephant in the room, and that is artificial intelligence. So it's that what is good is to have full employment, but full employment that is good. So we don't know where we're heading towards. I don't know whether what Philippe will say. It's pretty 18 and 68% of the population who might be affected. So there's a lot of anxiety with respect to this figures. So are some jobs going to be axed? When we don't adhere to that vision, we believe that 25% of jobs will be affected. And that brings us back to the conversions and training. We can come back to that. But what seems to be interesting for us is how we can, via AI, create some kind of hybridization and enrich jobs. Are the jobs that you can cite already? Well, yes, in X, this is what we're seeing. We've got a first revolution that's going to affect white-collar workers. There are lots of people who are explaining to me that being a consultant, that's a job that's going to be impacted. Some people are saying that 20% of young consultants will see their jobs disappearing. So young consultants are. So it's important to think about what purpose they're serving. So it's about analyzing. So if we can help them to be more efficient, be more relevant, then obviously they're going to have a future. So there are many AI tools that can help them to be more efficient. Now, the good news is that if they save 15 to 20% of their time, they can spend more time with their clients. Our focus is how to transform things. And consultants help with teamwork. They help with change. Our consultants are the first agents of change in any company. So I think that it's more a benefit to look at this from the point of view of hybridization than talking about added value. So I fight against the idea of automation and destruction from AI. I like to think of hybridization, but there is something that we need to think about, and that is tacit skills and the ability to enjoy work. That's something that we need to look out for. As Charlie Chaplin said in Modern Times, I'm looking, and we've got to create value at work and economic factors that we've already heard about from other speakers. The value of work, it's about producing the expected results, but I think there's another value that's essential, and that is drawing pleasure from the job that we do. I think that it's the role of business heads to look at that value from that double point of view. Did you want to react to François Omerel about drawing pleasure from work? Yes, we talked about working on Sunday. Nobody works on a Sunday out of pleasure. We agree with that, right? Why would you work on Sunday? Well, because it's better paid. It's quite simple. So we can talk about the value of work, but what about how it is actually paid for? So there's the cost of labor. So Stéphane, do you want to say something about the cost of labor in France? Because this seems to be a point of an obstacle to employment. Is it something specific to France, the cost of labor? I don't think that that's the real problem in France. The cost of labor, it's a problem for people who are not very well qualified. And France has really pulled out all the stops in terms of doing things for these with the different contracts, different pacts. We're at 80 billion in terms of public aid. In fact, we don't think about things in a targeted enough way. Now, training, initial training and further training and the needs of companies need to all be in line with each other. In OECD surveys, one that we do that's called the PIAC, that looks at the skills of adults, that shows that the level of skills is going down in France in terms of understanding tech, in terms of solving problems, in a digital context, for example, skills are going down. So this is a really important subject to be able to involve senior members of society. They have to be able to change jobs. And we've got the lowest training rate for senior members of society in France than in other countries, and compared with other age groups. So we're among the lowest. It's 60% in Norway, 60% in the United States. So we really need to think about adult training. It's not a problem of resources, it's a problem of method. So when it comes to resources for training, we spend an awful lot of money, public money and private money. When you bring the two together, we're talking about 35 billion. So that's almost as much as the budget for higher education and research. So it's a problem of method, of the way we do things, and it's a problem of targeting. It's the same thing for young people. Let me just finish with this, because the problem is really the same with young people. We've got an increase in the number of young people in the PISA survey. So young people who are not good at reading, solving maths problems. And a new fact for France is that we're seeing a drop in the highest performing. The educational system is seeing dropouts. So we had a lot of loss at the bottom of the ladder, lots of young people dropping out, but we were generating young people with a higher performance, but that high performance group is also seeing a decline. So it's important to really refocus on initial training. So we've got to focus on dropouts and make sure that they don't drop out. Apprenticeships, that's also important. It's important to recalibrate. But what are we doing with vocational training students? Well, we've got to make sure that there are more links with companies. So I'd like to say that if there's one thing that we need to focus on today, that it's not so much the question of the cost of labor or incentives for people to go back to work. We can maybe talk about that. But for me, the most important thing is access to training, to skills among young people and senior members of society. These are the two groups where in France there's a big difference. And that explains why we're not reaching full employment.
Christelle Morancé, did you want to respond to what's been said? Because with regards to training, you said we've put in place a new model, both for recruitment and for training. You said we needed to do something. Yes, I'd like to respond to what's just been said. I completely agree. There is access to training today, but we need to make it a lot more higher profile and more operational. The French system is that everyone gets involved, the national government, the regional governments, the employment centres. There's a whole bunch of different stakeholders, and that means the training offer is very hard to understand. With respect to initial training, particularly for young people, we need to completely reinvent our model. Vocational training, whether we're talking about apprenticeships or vocational schools, it's undervalued in France. Success for young people is considered to be academic training. It's not changed. We've seen vocational training increase, but not at pre-18 level, but a post-18 level. So people who comes, if someone who is very good at school but wants to do carpentry as a vocational course, let the young person do it. But unfortunately, our education system will steer them towards a much more general academic pathway. We need to rethink this ideology. Teachers need to rethink it, parents need to rethink it, and we need to highlight the value of vocational training. I often talk about apprenticeships and vocational courses as the quickest and shortest path to employment. Germany and Switzerland value these pathways a lot more highly. We need to rethink the system and make sure that these training courses are promoted. These manual professions need to be valued. We've got a very French system of careers guidance. Both the national government and the regions have responsibility for it. We need to make sure that young people can develop knowledge of different careers and professions in there available. In our region, we did what we called a big bang of employment. It wasn't just an exhibition with stands and things to visit, but it was focused on virtual reality and immersion experiences to show you what it's like to work in a factory. It's not like in the age of Emile Zola, but we're in what we call the Factory 4.0, a much more modern workplace. To go back to what I was saying about vocational training, in France, we've not got our heads around this idea of lifelong training, whether it's for people, job seekers, but even employees. It's really important to train employees to help them to upskill. In our country, I think we provide the least training compared to other countries. There's a lot of money around. A lot of money has been put on the table, but it's not used properly, not directed properly. Benoît Derigny. I wanted to talk a bit about training, but also just refer back to what we were saying about labour costs. I think we need to be a bit careful in the current climate. There's a lot of uncertainty around Donald Trump's tariffs, and I'm seeing a very wait-and-see attitude from the businesses that I work with, and there might be some trade-offs, some difficult decisions made by multinational groups. So we need to be very careful with labour costs in a context where tariff barriers are going to shift again. And the question a number of big companies are asking is, where am I going to buy, where am I going to produce, where am I going to sell if they have a worldwide footprint? So the labour cost is not the only thing, but it's one of the ways the decisions are made. With respect to vocational training, I completely agree. Our system is much too complex. It's almost a science. We train 30,000 people per year. We have specialized teams in order to manage all of the different government mechanisms that operate at different levels, national, regional, and all of this to do something which is at the heart fairly simple. So we really need to simplify things. The resources are available, but the complex situation means that for employers it's pretty tricky. In a sense, for us as a business, it's a good thing, but our clients need a lot of help with it. The second issue, which I think is really fundamental, we have something in terms of employment in France. People say young people need to study for longer, but longer period of study is not a solution. The real thing is to focus on the needs of the labour markets, and the needs of the labour markets are skilled manual work, where there is a big outlook. There's a real outlook for those professions who are requiring upskilling. We need to train young people. We don't need to give them more years of training, but we need to make those professions attractive. They're interesting, they're very diverse, and they're going to see a lot of technological innovation. So I think there's a role for initial training and lifelong learning as well. I just wanted to go back to the idea that everyone is doing something, but no one's really taking care of it. I think the most relevant player in this is business. the fact that employees care about their own training and that businesses care about the training of their employees, if that were to happen, we'd have taken a big step forward. I think we talk about a tension on the labour market in some professions. We need to pay attention to this. One of the biggest example is Deutsche Bahn, the rail service in Germany. Yes, we're talking about the German rail company. That's correct. What have they done? They need people. They've used all of the government mechanisms, but they said we're going to focus on our needs, our skills needs. So they've got a recruitment method which is new. They're focusing on recruiting as widely as possible. But we see big corporations, big groups that are putting in place their own training schools. Yes, I think they're right to do that because they're focusing on their needs over time, and they realize that the best people to train the people they need are themselves. So I think one very interesting issue around Deutsche Bahn is that they've changed the profile of the people they're recruiting. What do you mean by that? They are trying to recruiting younger people. They're trying to recruit older people actually as well. They're recruiting people through inclusion and diversity initiatives because they're interested in the people they're recruiting, not necessarily people who've had a long-term training. They're interested in the people, and they take care of training their new recruits for the professions and the careers they're going to follow. So I think we need to rethink training. Should business play a role in training, in your view? Yes, I'm very clear about this issue. 15 years ago, I was the National Secretary for Vocational Training within our trade union. And I would say that over the last 15 years, I've been hearing the same song, the same refrain repeated again and again. Each new government comes in and says the same thing: training costs too much, it's a mess, we don't understand what's going on, we're going to reform it. We've had 5 reforms of vocational training, which all came from a political initiative. And what's changed? Perhaps they were starting from a good starting point. Yeah, I imagine that they might start from a good starting point, but some of the national initiatives are not always the best thing to do. With respect to vocational training, I think the most productive and constructive initiatives come from the grassroots up. I think there's a misunderstanding. We need to think about vocational training, housing and families. You might say there's nothing to do with these different subjects, but I think they've got lots to do with each other. These are all issues on a national level where people are saying, what is the objective? What is the target? Do we have economic development targets or economic competitiveness targets, or do we have a social target? And my example could apply in the same way to housing. Is the aim to look after people who need housing, who are struggling with housing, or is it about people moving from one area of France to another to go after jobs? And again, in terms of family policy, I think anyone might ask, why is the family policy funded by an employer or an employee contribution? It doesn't seem to be a big success because our birth rates are continuing to fall. So there's a real issue. This is an issue which is currently debated by trade unions and employers' federations. Well, yes, indeed, that's what the issue is. The issue we have with vocational training is that the 5 different reforms we have since 2010 have the following objectives. Firstly, to broaden out the training market. Needed to be turned into a market so that companies that provide training could have a bigger cake to share out. That was the first objective. Secondly, there was a social objective to say, well, if you've missed out on good initial training, with your vocational training rights, you can invest in a form of individual competitiveness on the labour market. Total bullshit. The only thing that works is training that is tied into jobs that are genuinely available within one's company. And that's what existed within the old-fashioned training patterns that we had. We haven't created a market. Within our trade union, we think that we need when we think about vocational training, to think about economic efficiency. What do I mean by economic efficiency? What I talk about is giving someone a means to promote investment in businesses, focusing on infrastructure and people who are going to have a career development thanks to this vocational training, to create movement within our businesses and within society. Thank you. Stéphane, with respect to training, why is this a crucial issue for employment? Well, I think that in France and in most developed countries, we are moving from a model whereby there was a labour shortage to a model where there is a shortage of skilled labour. The aging process is tipping our world towards a structural shortage of skilled manual labour. So I think training and skills are really going to be at the heart of the solution that needs to be developed. Just to go back to the reforms that have been carried out in France, the personal training account is an incredible tool. I think it was an incredible tool, reform that was carried out in creating this. I consider it to be a very broad success, a public success. People really have taken hold of this tool, including the least skilled workers. 16% of the beneficiaries of this scheme have no qualification. 23% have only got a vocational training. So these categories of workers do use the scheme. The issue is the lack of coordination with other schemes, the fact that employers don't use the individual training accounts. They don't pay into it themselves in order to offer new training opportunities for their employees. The fact that in small business, business leaders don't realise the value of trainings. The training rate of employees in small businesses is often lower than in the larger businesses. Coordination between the different stakeholders is very important. I was part of the Scientific Council for Skills Investment over 5 years. There were 5 billion euros on the table. There's no lack of money. And the skills plan had a number of targets. We wanted to focus training on the people who needed it the most, young people, older people, less skilled workers. But that was a big failure. More training was carried out, but it was training for all. There was a failure in targeting. Why was it a failure? There was a lack of coordination between the national governments, the job centres, the regional governments. But it was impossible to coordinate the different stakeholders in order to target the relevant populations. We failed as well to target the professions that were under pressure. We weren't able to target the right professions. I'm not a specialist in organisation and consulting, but when you have clearly defined targets, a load of money and a methodology, and it's not working, you need to open up the hood, look under the bonnet and see what's going on in terms of coordination between the different elements of the machine, the different stakeholders. There's something that isn't working in terms of organisation and coordination of the stakeholders in vocational training. It's a central issue for our economy today and tomorrow. Let me just go back to what's been said. I kind of agree with what Francois said when you talk about stakeholders that don't coordinate things very well. We don't talk about businesses. Businesses generally understand what they need. So the stakeholder that could use these schemes and play a role in federating people, bringing people together, it should be business. What I see in the businesses that I'm working with is that the businesses that have the resources to do so are taking care of this issue, are doing so better and better because they are looking for solutions elsewhere. There is an issue amongst smaller and medium-sized businesses because they need to coordinate and work together because they can't do it all themselves. But in all of the systems that you are talking about, and you know better than I do, the reality that's at the centre is that the business should be at the heart of things. The business should be able to define the work they're going to need, the labour they need today, the labour they need in the future. They need to think about what they're going to do with AI. We should stop saying that AI is just going to destroy jobs. It's not true. If we're smart, we will be able to develop skills using AI if we work the right way. But let's make sure that businesses can play a catalyst role in all of these mechanisms because businesses can find solutions. So we can see that in the subject of full employment, the elephant in the room is training. So let's keep a bit of time for questions from the floor. Please take a microphone, introduce you, and ask a question. We're really asking you to ask questions rather than make comments. Let's ask the young lady in pink. Can we get a microphone to the young lady in pink, please? Thank you for giving me the floor. My name is Morgan. I'm an apprentice in recruitment, and I am getting training at Montpellier Business School. I agree with what you say. I've got another perspective on the question rather than training. We want a full employment policy, but we're seeing businesses outsourcing, and we're seeing skills and a brain drain. We're not seeing a Keynesian virtuous circle. So my question is, how can we believe in the possibility of full employment without a very deliberate public policy on a Keynesian point of view? François, let me answer you. Over the last 15 years, we have been spending the government's money on what we refer to as supply-side economics. We've been investing 2.2% of GDP in R&D, 3.5% in Germany, and 4.5% in South Korea. When we emptied out the research centres, Emmanuel Macron said, "Come to work with us." But what Macron doesn't know is that in American research centres, there's loads of French researchers because it's too precarious a profession in France. Christelle Morancy, you talked about the skills drain, the brain drain, and deindustrialization. I don't want to hear us talking about reindustrialization in France without us having to sort out the issue of tax and competitiveness, the business taxes, the issue of social security contributions, and the issue of the 35-hour working week. Once we've sorted that out, we can talk about reindustrialization. Businesses are not competitive. That's why jobs go elsewhere. I don't think that the 35-hour working week is top of this Prime Minister's priorities, but we will hear some discussions about taxes and social security charges on the 15th of July, I think. It's a very French attitude to say, oh, we're not doing very well. But when you look at the level of attractiveness of France, and we work with all types of businesses, big corporations and small businesses right across France, the thing that we come back to is that there is a high level of training, and particularly higher education in France, the attractiveness of the country, because it's a nice country to live in. And so when they need to bring some of their teams in, France is an attractive place. It's not lagging behind. There are things that need to be improved, but there are lots of strengths and things that are attractive in France. Yes, sir. I think we need to go beyond ideology. What's your question? I have the following question. I've heard people talking about the value of work. I agree with the union representative. It's about the value of work, and the value of work depends on how interesting the salary, the wages are. Also, the duration of working hours. The 35-hour working week is a thing of the past. It's now 36 hours. So you need to take into account the reality of precarious, vulnerable working. We are in line with the European average today. I think a blind spot in terms of full employment is work sharing. There's an ideology around laziness and working time. There are a lot of people who work for 0 hours. There's some people working for 13 hours and would like to work more. And I think it's time to bring in a reform. It's been blocked for several years. We've created the working hours have been halved over the last century, and we've created 14 million jobs. Maybe pass on the microphone to the young lady next to you. Over to you. Good morning. Thank you very much for this panel. I'd like to ask a question to Stéphane Garcia. At the start, you highlighted the increase in the employment rate. However, alongside that, a lot of reform has taken place to try and reduce the rigidity of the employment market. Should the increase in the employment rate take place through making work more precarious for the workers? So it's a contrast between employment rate and the quality of the work. Well, this is a real issue. In Germany, there's the initiative that's referred to as mini jobs. It created employment, but the working conditions weren't great. In UK, you have the 0 hours contracts. In the Netherlands, there's a lot of part-time working. So that all of those initiatives have happened to a lesser extent, actually, in France up till now. And what we see, actually, in France is employment hasn't become massively more precarious. Temporary contracts and part-time working has remained relatively constant. There are increasing numbers of very short-term contracts. The number of employment contracts of less than 1 month are going up. The overall amount of temporary contracts is reduced, and there are more permanent contracts, but there are some very, very short employment contracts which are not very attractive. So we need to find the right balance between issues that will enable us to increase the employment rate, because we're meeting very short-term business needs, and the need to create career paths for people who have a fairly chaotic on-off employment record. The gentleman right at the back, you've been raising your hand and waving enthusiastically. Could you ask a question and introduce yourself? Thank you. My name is Arnaud. I'm an ex-teacher and trainer. Compared to other rich countries, people who graduate after 3 or 5 years in the university, the employment people can get doesn't pay a good salary for teachers and these types of things. So who is going to kick the system up the backside to make things moving? I think it's a simple question. It seems like it. Let me say one thing to you. We've talked a lot about the cost of labor and competitiveness. I think we need to deconstruct this concept. If the competitiveness of a country and its businesses was directly linked to the level of wages, Switzerland would be the poorest country. We can see it's not true. Competitivity is not directly related to the average level of wages. It might be the opposite of what we think. So by choosing precarious employment, by choosing to support unskilled jobs, France is heading into the wall. I think we're heading down a dead end. I think we need to fund the economy by focusing on upskilling. We need to pay our teachers better. We need to pay for economic development. We need to pay for high quality jobs, and then we'll be going in the right direction. Let me just give you a little story from our group. We work in a number of countries, and it's interesting to look at what's happening in countries that have full employment. There's 3% unemployment in Poland or in Czechia. It's useful to look at those perspectives. There are situations where wages are rising. It's a situation where people have longer-term employment contracts. More people are included in the world of work. There's greater levels of inclusion. There's a lot of benefits on the labour market, which mean that for France, it would be really great to move forward quicker towards full employment and make the changes necessary. A final point, just to go back to what the gentleman said. He's right, particularly healthcare jobs are not well enough paid, but the solution is to reduce social security contributions. For 100 euros that are paid out, 60% of it goes to the government. So we need to reduce social security contributions. There's a lot to be done. A final word. I love these macro-level debates. I think part of the solution, however, is on a micro level in each business. So we need to give the businesses the opportunity to solve some of these problems. And I think the opposite is happening. So let me sum up: simplicity, pragmatism, break down some of the costly and complex system. Stéphane, any final conclusions? I think France is going to get to full employment at some stage. I'm fairly optimistic. I think we have made progress over the last few years. There have been a lot of good reforms. We've seen an increase, a clear increase in the rate of employment. Business needs and the role of businesses will create further pressure to sort the system out. So I think when we get back to growth is around 0.5, 0.6 at the moment for this year, so it's difficult to create more jobs with such little growth. But when growth comes back to the economy, I think we will end up seeing unemployment falling and an increase in the rate of employment. Thank you for this optimistic conclusion. Thank you to all of you on the panel. Thank you to the speakers and everyone who's been in the audience. We'll talk about these subjects again next year at the Rencontre EDEX. Thank you.